They zipped my suitcase and drove away like it was a weekend trip. I learned to survive in the spaces they left behind. This started with a suitcase and a hollow apology. I was 11 when my parents set my duffel by the front door and said, "We're helping some friends for a bit." No plan, no promises, just a quick peck on the forehead and a slammed car door. I remember the driveway like a photograph yellow porch light. Uncut grass, the Morrisons' house smelling faintly of old soap. They were church acquaintances with too many chores and too little room. I slept in a top bunk next to their youngest daughter, who kept her distance like I was a new headline she hadn't learned to ignore. Their boys pretended I wasn't there. The Morrises were not cruel. They were simply full. I learned the difference between being neglected and being actively unwanted. At first, my parents called every Sunday. Then the calls thinned to once a month, and then a silence long enough to learn how to wait without expectation. I waited with my phone beside the pillow, full battery, and a naive hope that it would buzz. When their photos from beaches and cafes started showing up in my classmates' feeds, I read them like a foreign language. Paris, Thailand, Greece. Their captions framed it as a restorative trip with friends. Not once did they ask how I was. Not once did they ask if I had homework or a fever. Their absence folded into my days like a ghost in the mustard-colored kitchen where I made my own lunches. At school, I lied. Parents abroad, hard to reach. That was easier than admitting I didn't know if my parents would come back. At 12, I received a keychain from Mrs. Morrison on my birthday. A small plastic trinket with my name printed crookedly. She said, "Sorry about the chaos." I put it in my pencil case like a relic. It became a small, private proof that someone had thought to notice me for a moment. But mostly, I learned to disappear with purpose. No complaints, no drama jest, straight A's, and a quiet mouth. If you make yourself useful and small, people forget to ask why you're missing. I kept the receipts, the school certificates, the little cards Mrs. Morrison slipped me when adults weren't looking. They were evidence I existed. At 14, I started babysitting. I tucked cash into a shoebox behind my dresser and told myself it was safety, not rebellion. My parents noticed my increasing maturity and used it as proof I didn't need them. The details that would have made them uneasy: no hugs when I had a fever. No one to sign permission slips became my private ledger. I filed them away and planned. Graduate early, move far, make a life that doesn't require explanation. I would leave without drama, because drama is the thing that brings people back only to remind you why you left. I mapped my escape in margins, extra credits, summer classes, scholarship applications printed on the school library computer where no one would notice. My counselor thought I was ambitious. I was meticulous. My parents told church friends. Versions of "we're figuring things out." I learned how to navigate forms and financial aid. At 16, they took a road trip and left me in the back seat, a passenger slipping into the scenery. I used babysitting money to buy a winter coat and an old paperback about budgeting. I quietly became fluent in the language of adulthood leases. Bank accounts, applications, words my parents never taught me because they never had time. The morning I told them about college, I waited until dinner. My mother skimmed the name and said, "That's pretty far." My father smiled and said, "Guess we raised you well." No plan, no campus tours, no conversation about dorms. They nodded and moved on to flight schedules, as if distance was a logistics problem. It's not a wound. I left with thrift store luggage and $1,200 saved in that shoebox. I hugged them in the terminal briefly and without theatrics, then walked into the security line and blocked their numbers before the plane took off. The act of not looking back felt less like courage and more like avoiding another round of false promises. College was not rescue. It was a room with a lock and a schedule that belonged to me. I worked nights at a diner, took 2 classes in the morning, and learned to make scrambled eggs that tasted like independence. I opened a bank account with my name on it, signed forms, and filled out employment paperwork without parental signatures. I became, in small bureaucratic steps, someone who could answer to herself. Friendships formed around study sessions and night shifts, not at holiday tables. Holidays were practiced absences. I'd buy boxed mac and cheese and string lights in a friend's studio apartment. My parents sent a framed photo from the holidays once. Their smiling faces surrounded a tree. My image wasn't missing so much as intentionally excluded. I filed the frame into the donation box weeks later, but the months of building safety were not without cost. There was a ledger of things I never said aloud: blame, confusion, the particular cruelty of small everyday betrayals. I started therapy at 21 to understand how to grieve a childhood that had been interrupted, and what it meant to forgive people who had never asked for it. My therapist taught me that independence isn't just leaving, it's learning to live with the echoes. Years passed and the ledger turned into a foundation. I finished school with honors, saved enough for a small condo, and named my first cat Sparrow Tiny. And Fierce, the kind of companion that understands silence. I kept the old keychain in a drawer. Sometimes I pulled it out and felt the small imprint of survival. At 28, letters began to arrive again with different tones. A law firm wrote about a family matter. Cousins emailed invitations with perfunctory "we miss you" lines. I filed them in the safe where I'd kept painful mail for years and forgot about them until curiosity pried the envelope open. The will, the estate, the mansion that seemed to exist more in other people's plans than in ours. Grandmother Iris had left me her legacy, everything. The rooms where I had once been invisible now contained the very thing they had assumed would prove their worth. The reading of the will was a kind of theater. Relatives arrived with legal pads and polished shoes, measuring their own hunger with professional calm. When the lawyer spoke, it was almost a punctuation mark. To quin my name in her document, she left the rest. The silence that followed was an audible thing. Mouths opened and closed like startled fish. The letters she'd left me were simple and fierce. She'd remembered whose hand had held hers every Tuesday, whose cookies had warmed her afternoons. In a single legal breath, a family history of neglect became evidence. They accused me of manipulation and undue influence. They tried to contest the will. They suggested I had somehow changed her mind. But the files we'd prepared recordings. Attendance logs, the nurse's testimony, turned their accusations into noise. The house had always been hers, and she gave it not to punish, but to reward the one who'd shown up. At first, the aftermath was chaos. Calls flooded in pleas, threats, promises to change. I listened and decided to respond with the tool I'd used most: distance. I didn't owe immediate forgiveness or a redistribution of what had been given to me by someone who had loved me when others didn't. They asked for meetings, for family trusts, for sharing the wealth. They imagined their lives saved by checks and quieted their consciences with talk of togetherness. I recorded conversations for protection, not revenge. I shared them only when necessary. Lawsuits were threatened and collapsed when the evidence didn't support their claims. Their lives, built on assumptions and entitlement, began to wobble. Foreclosures, closed businesses, and broken engagements followed in the months after the will reading. They had planned on a windfall that never came. I didn't gloat. The shift in the family dynamic was not justice in my eyes. It was consequence. It gave me time to decide what kind of steward I wanted to be. The dust settled slowly. Some family members reached out with apologies that smelled faintly of convenience. Others tried to rebuild through contrived acts of generosity. I wrote 2 checks. One small, one symbolic, both given without expectation of repair. My parents called. For weeks their voices were apologetic and then defensive. I listened, set boundaries, and told them the only reconciliation I'd accept would be steady effort visits. Presence, not promises, my life shaped by self-reliance, allowed me to choose how much of them I would let back in. I invested in a community center because Iris had been a builder, and the mansion should be open to people who needed help. I set up a scholarship in her name for students who, like me, were doing their best on small budgets. Who'd supported me through the fight and made room at the table for people who proved their loyalty through kindness. Slowly, the family that had mattered most became a new constellation, a collection of people who showed up. Some relatives worked to repair their mistakes honestly. Some faded into the background. My parents made a quiet decision to retire and sell the bakery they loved, and in that slow closing, they apologized in ways that affected me. Consistent calls. Visits where they didn't expect to be forgiven. Small acts that were not calculated for headlines. It wasn't complete, and perhaps it never would be. But it was different. The last scene is not a confrontation, but a small reclamation. I stand in a room that once kept me out and invite a group of young people to learn skills my grandmother once taught me: how to manage a budget, how to write a resume, how to make a roast that feeds more than one. Sparrow curls at my feet. The little keychain is now a pendant on a chain around my neck. No longer a token of pain, but a reminder of the kid who planned a life on the outside until the inside made sense.